Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
That always sounds so official, doesn't it?
It does, Jimmy. I like that.
We are just so professional.
Well, we're trying to be now.
I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Okay, so last week, we talked about the SBC's terrible not caring well policy, and the one that is at J.D. Greer's church. J.D. Greer, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and they have a policy regarding what to do with sex offenders. And if you missed that episode, basically, the abridged version is, you welcome them all, and you hide them within your church. In a nutshell, that's their policy. So I had several people reaching out to me, and they were asking, well, okay, that's great that you think this is a bad policy for sex offenders. What would a good policy look like? Fair enough. I think that's very fair.
Yeah, it's important, right, to show a good policy.
Because I think that's one of the problems where sometimes in advocacy, we're really good at pointing out where the flaws are and not coming up with a solution. I don't want to be that person. I think we're here to help people, not only to see where there are weaknesses, but to encourage them and invite them to actually be doing the right thing. So that's what this episode is about. What does a good policy look like? And this isn't really a policy. These are more principles. And this will be before you ever really develop a policy for registered sex offenders. Just to break a myth that sometimes floats around, no, I do not believe that all sex offenders should be banned from church. That's just a myth. However, I will say probably the majority of sex offenders would be. And by banned, I mean banned from being near children. It's not that they're banned from church. If they're truly repentant, I will stand behind them all day long. But they're not going to be near my kids or anybody else's. So if that's what their offense is for, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I was thinking about this too, and I think it would be really helpful for people if we created some kind of a flow chart to determine whether a sex offender should be able to attend. I'm not a huge fan of flow charts, but I think they certainly serve a purpose. And I think for this, we could get pretty close and have something that's actually really resourceful. So, Granny, I didn't tell you this, but...
He called me Granny. Oh, no. Whoa.
I didn't tell you this, but I'm going to recruit you to help me make this flowchart.
Thank you, Jim. You think my granny brain is able to do that?
I mean, just for context,
yes.
In the family, her nickname is Granny.
Yes.
So
I'm okay with that, people. Just as a joke.
So now everybody's going to call you Granny on Facebook and Twitter.
Oh. Thanks, Jim.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think it'd be helpful to develop some kind of a flow chart to determine whether a sex offender should be able to attend or not. And I think we can do that fairly easily.
So basically, what you're saying is it's more individualized than just having a policy that's black and white.
Yeah, you can't have a blanket policy for this.
And I want you to clarify that, because some people might have only heard a portion of last week's podcast or portions from previous ones, and it sounds like today you're backpedaling. It's
Yeah,
like,
no. Mm-mm.
Jimmy Hinton said first that sex offenders can't attend church. Now he's saying, well, maybe some can. But yeah, this chart, I think, will really help give guidance.
Yeah, you just have to use discernment. And there are sex offenders who are in prison who do not have any attraction to children. There are sex offenders in prison who have offenses against adult victims, and they're not predators.
Right.
And they're certainly not child predators. So, I think it's really important to understand what the offenses were and to actually look into the records, because just because somebody has the sex offender status doesn't mean they're automatically a child predator. Doesn't mean that they're automatically going to abuse
Well, we have
kids.
to do our research and know the crime.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to, so we'll talk about this as this unfolds.
Yep.
So I think first and foremost, one of the most important things that we can do is determine whether somebody has a past of crimes or a pattern of crimes. This word past crimes is used all the time by church leaders. I hear it over and over and over again, and they'll say something like, well, they did their time for their past sins. And they don't call them crimes usually. Usually it's their past sins.
Right.
And the implication is what's in the past is in the past. And, they had a come to Jesus moment in prison, and now they're reformed. And because of God's grace, they're just as deserving as everybody else, so leave them alone. The problem with that is that the language doesn't accurately reflect whether something is actually truly in the past or whether there's been an ongoing pattern of abuse. So we need to make that distinction. Is something really in the past, or has there been a pattern? Are there multiple victims? Or are there multiple allegations? What exactly did they do? What's the nature of their crime? You actually have to investigate and look into this. You can't just assume that because somebody tells you that they had one victim back in 1952 that's so far back they can't remember their victim's name, that doesn't necessarily mean that's true. And you can't take that as gospel. You actually have to look into whether there was a pattern of abuse, or whether this was somebody who was the 22-year-old boyfriend who got caught with his 17-year-old girlfriend and got reported and got arrested and now is a registered sex offender. That does happen.
It happens frequently.
Yeah.
Actually. Right.
So, determine whether it's really past crimes or whether it's a pattern of abuse.
And Jimmy, I like that you differentiated between the words, because pattern gives us a sense of ongoing something. It just wasn't something that happened the one time. Oopsie, I slipped up. I shouldn't have done that. I was a bad person. I prayed. I got forgiveness. I'm done. But a pattern is multiple times.
Yeah. I mean, let me give an example of something that's past versus pattern. Somebody gets wildly drunk at a party. Wildly drunk. Blacks out, doesn't even remember what they did the night before. And they walk out into the street and they just start, it's a busy sidewalk. People are walking down the sidewalk and they just start exposing themselves. They get arrested and, they get some kind of a criminal charge. And I'm not an attorney and I don't pretend to be one, but, they get some kind of a charge for public intoxication and
indecent exposure.
Indecent exposure. Yeah. That's the word I was looking for. Okay. So, that's somebody I think who would be registered as a sex offender for a short time. And that's the other thing we'll talk about too, length of the sex offender registry. Is that person somebody who frequently goes out and exposes his body parts to females and thinks it's funny? Or is this somebody who one time got highly intoxicated and didn't even remember what he was doing? Not that that's okay. And that's why it's important to communicate what the sex offense was to your church. But you have to use your brain. does this person have a pattern of that kind of behavior, or is this person really embarrassed about it and apologetic about it and honest about it?
Right.
Do they openly communicate what they did in the past? And are they frank with you? Are they blunt? Are they honest? And are they embarrassed?
A person who does not have a pattern of this type of behavior is going to be extremely upset with him or herself.
Right.
And just ashamed and very apologetic and begging forgiveness. Whereas a person who has a pattern that's this big party goer that gets bombed out of their heads every weekend and has no problem ripping clothes off in the middle of the street and thinks it's a funny joke.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pattern.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, there's a world of difference between the two.
The second point is to talk to investigators to find out find out information before talking with the sex offender. So what a lot of people do is they first talk to the sex offender, they listen to their story, they get reeled in, and it's very enticing when you talk to sex offenders and anybody who's lived with a sex offender, with an abuser rather, anybody who's lived with an abuser or has been abused by an abuser will tell you. I mean, they are extremely intoxicating when you talk to them. They're inviting. You get reeled in. You get sucked into their story, and they're very believable because they're practiced liars. So what most churches do is they'll talk to the sex offender, and then when I try to present evidence and say, look, I looked up their record. Here's what it actually is. They don't want to hear it.
Right.
They're like, yeah, but we talked to them. And you can't always believe what you see on paper. Whereas if you do that in reverse order, you talk to investigators first, and you look up records first, and you find out information that's on paper. Then you talk to the sex offender who wants to attend church or is already at your church and compare notes. And I use the principle of the 3 V's. This is really hard to remember, so stick with me. 3 V's: verify, verify, verify.
I like that, and it's so important. It's critical.
Does their story match what's on paper? Or is it vastly different? And if it's vastly different, which 99% of the time, in my experience, in working with churches and just walking them through different processes, 99% of the time, the stories are vastly different.
Well, and you said it, why it is, because there's a pattern of being a liar. There's a pattern of being manipulative. There's a pattern of being deceitful.
Right.
There's a pattern that's ingrained in that person to be that way. So,
and it's in their best interest to lie because they know most church leaders aren't going to look up the records. And the other thing is, the caveat to that is, if church leaders do look up records, if the sex offender has gotten their narrative out there first, they know how unbelievable that paperwork is. Right. Because all of a sudden, well, I had a crooked investigator, or I had a crooked wife who had a vendetta against me, or, whatever it is, And so, yeah, they paint the victims as if they're crazy and just had an axe to grind, and they were the innocent target of a bad investigation.
They got a raw deal.
Yeah,
they're the one that got a raw deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Which leads to the next important point: look up court dockets. Don't just talk to investigators. And some investigators are just busy and they're not going to give you the time of day. That's a reality. But court dockets are public information as long as it is not a minor person who was arrested. These court dockets are public information, and most of them now you can look up electronically. Some places you can't. You have to physically go to the courthouse, but look at the court dockets. And what you're going to find in the court dockets is a lot more than you'll ever find in a newspaper article or, an article online. Look up the court dockets and figure out how many charges they actually had, what the charges were, and how many of those were waived. And
I think that's critical.
In my dad's case, there were 200 charges, multiple felony charges, tons of misdemeanors, and 3 of those stuck.
Yep.
197 were waived as part of a plea deal because he pled guilty.
Right.
they allowed him to waive 197. Doesn't mean he didn't do them. He was guilty of every one of those charges, but they allowed him to waive those as part of a plea deal. Look up court dockets. That will tell you all of the charges, what they are, and how many of those were waived as part of a plea deal. The next point is to contact a former church where this person may have attended. The sex offender, contact former or current boss, and contact people who are willing to be honest. One of the things that really bugs me about some of these processes, and you know, the SBC's policy was really no different, is that there's this interview time with a sex offender where you automatically give them the benefit of the doubt and you allow them to use their own references. And the one with the SBC was even worse because it was asking the sex offender if you could have their permission to contact a previous church they went to. What in the world? You never ask them for permission. You just do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And references are a joke and a waste of time because they hand select the people that you're going to talk to. They hand pick the people who you're going to talk to. Well, think about that when you get a job. Do you pick somebody who's going to be brutally honest about your character? Or do you pick somebody who's your friend, your buddy, somebody who's going to speak highly of you? You always do that when you're seeking employment. And how much more so when you're being interviewed by church leaders to see if they're going to allow a sex offender to participate in church. So don't use references. Don't ask them for references. I would say contact a former church, contact a former boss, contact people who are willing to be honest, and just start asking basic questions, you know, and find out, was there a pattern? Were there more allegations that don't appear on this person's record?
Even this method is not always foolproof because when you're talking with churches, you found it to be true. I know it's to be true. There's a level of, I'm going to go right out and say it, dishonesty, because we have that big old thing, forgiveness. You must forgive. You must overlook.
Yep.
God
We're all
forgave.
about grace and mercy. Why would you pry into somebody's past?
And we are fearful to say something negative most of the time when it's church related. We don't want to say, well, there is this one thing that I think you should know.
Yeah.
We would rather be quiet about that one thing and say, well, yeah, that person is really fun to be around. They're very outgoing. They cause no problems within the church. We'd rather say that than quite often the brutal, honest truth.
Yeah.
I have this bad vibe, or I know this about that person.
But at least it's another level.
It is.
You know, it's another layer to trying to find information out. You're doing due diligence to find out, you know, is this person
who they say
broken?
Yeah.
Are they honest? Are they broken? Are they remorseful?
I think we need to do it.
You know, and do they have a past or do they have a pattern? There's a difference.
Right.
The next point is, what is their tier? Most states have a tier system, tier 1, 2, and 3. Some states have tier 4. So think of the lower numbers as, I hate using the word risk, lower risk, but that's kind of how they grade them. Lower offenses, I guess. So your more misdemeanor charges, things like that. What is their tier? And are they registered sex offenders for life? Or are they registered for 5 years, 10 years? If they're a lifetimer, there's a reason for that. And did they plea charges down? So what's their tier? You know, that's really important. Some tiers require notification due to their level of aggression or risk. Keep in mind this is fluid. Keep in mind that tiers change according to plea deals. It happens all the time.
That's just what I was going to say.
They could be a tier 3 and get a tier 1 as part of a plea deal.
Right.
Because they pled guilty, had no priors, et cetera, et cetera. They actually shift that from a tier 3 to a tier 1, even though they're a tier 3. They could be a very dangerous sex offender and only have a tier 1. So this is not foolproof. This is just another layer. But find out. If they're a tier 3 and that's stuck, and they're a lifetime, well, tier 3s are lifetime registrants anyway. There's a reason for that. So for us, that's automatically a tier 3 is a they're not attending our church. We'll find an alternative service if they're interested in that, but we're not going to risk having a tier 3. That's just that's written into policy.
Now I want you to clarify again. So some people think you're not putting bars up at your church door. They're not attending this service within your church with children.
Unless they're a tier 3, if they're a violent rapist of adult women, they're not attending our church. Right. Period.
Okay.
We'll find an alternative service if they're truly repentant, but it's not going to include women.
Right.
If they raped a bunch of women and they're a tier 3, they're not going to attend church with women. They're just not going to do it. So yeah, it may include putting bars up. I mean, if that's what it takes to keep them out, but we have to identify who's a wolf and who's a truly repentant person. That's what we have to distinguish. We have to figure this out. It's not as easy as creating these blanket policies and saying, well, everybody receives the grace of God. Or in the case of this policy that we critiqued last week, we will reiterate throughout this process that you are fully forgiven by God. Well, that's really horrible theology, and it's dangerous, and that's going to get people hurt. Next point, are they on probation or parole? Some states don't allow them to be near children if they're on probation or parole. If they are on probation or parole, you must talk to their officer and notify them, let them know that they came to your church, let them know what they're looking for, that is the sex offender, and find out, ask point blank, are they prohibited from being here? And if so, why? And I would go a step further and say, what is it that may not be on their record that we need to be aware of about this person? If somebody's on probation, that doesn't automatically disqualify them from being at your church. Again, it could be the 22-year-old who had sex with his 17-year-old girlfriend, or vice versa. 22-year-old girl who had sex with her 17-year-old boyfriend, who's on the registry. They got a 2-year sentence, and because of good behavior and everything else, they get probation. That's somebody that, they're not automatically disqualified, but you absolutely have to talk to their probation or parole officer and find out what are the stipulations. Can I see a copy of their agreement with the prison system and what they can and can't do? And then the next point, check their social media. They should not have social media. Find out also if they're legally allowed to have social media. My understanding is that most sex offenders are not permitted to have social media once they get out of prison. That's not something that's regulated because they can't. Prisons are so busy. Do you think they have time to babysit people on the registry to find out if they're on social media or not? Doesn't work that way. And I know from having friends who are in the prisons that they said it's absolutely impossible to monitor them.
Right.
Once they're out in prison, even if we have all these restrictions, we can't monitor them.
I'm just shaking my
know.
head sitting here because having worked in the prison for several years now and having a lot of dealings with tier 1, 2, and 3 prisoners,
mm-hmm.
I know what you're talking about firsthand because they talk very openly about this.
Mm-hmm.
They know what they can get away with and what
mm-hmm.
they can't. And this is not just somebody that's in for a DUI or something. I was in with a lot of sex offenders,
mm-hmm.
really brutal sex offenders, and they knew right away what they could get away with and what they couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And very rarely did I see any attitude that was like, oh, I am going to watch my P's and Q's. It was more like, what can I get away with?
Yeah. But in the process, ironically or paradoxically, I'm going to comply with every rule.
Yeah, well.
I'm going to be compliant. I'm going to show up to my meetings. I'm going to, whatever I have to do. Yeah, absolutely.
Any volunteer meeting or anything that they could get to, they are there in hopes that it means an earlier out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
If they do have social media, look and see, are they being gross or inappropriate on it? Really search and find out. And, well, Jimmy G, that's gossip. No, it's not. Why should we be stalking people? And, they did their time. Because they landed in prison. And they landed in prison for doing something really gross and egregious and harmful to other innocent people. So it is not only your right to look at what's publicly listed on Facebook or Twitter or whatever else, Instagram. It's not only your right, it's your responsibility.
Right. Absolutely.
You have every legal and moral right to look at their profiles and see what kind of things they're posting and what kind of comments they're making about both adults and children.
Social media tells a story.
It does.
Like none other.
Yeah.
It truly does.
So then finally, the last point, and we could probably come up with many more, but we don't want to make this an exhaustive list. But the last point here is, in the rare case that a church should have a sex offender, the church absolutely should be notified of the status and what crimes landed them on the registry. Whether that was, take the recent example of the youth pastor, the youth minister who slapped the reporter on the rear end. She pressed charges against him. Mm-hmm. She pressed because he slapped and grabbed, and she was having none of it, and she pressed charges. So he got arrested. If he lands on the sex offender registry, any church that he goes to, whether he's a minister again or whether he's just a lay member, they must be notified. And somebody who's repentant will be fully transparent, and they'll be embarrassed, they'll be ashamed, and they'll tell people, yeah, this is what I did, and I'm not proud of it. Right. But you need to know. You need to know that not only am I on the registry, this is why I'm on the registry. And I'll show you the video clips. Or you can Google it and look at the video clips. And I'm so embarrassed. And I can't believe I did it. And so again, when you piece all of these together, is there a pattern, or was this a case where this guy, for whatever reason, lost his brain, which still is not okay, and he should have charges pressed against him? But was it a case where the guy just was being stupid?
That's what I would call, yeah.
Which can happen. I'm living proof. You can do stupid things.
Oh, so am I. Oh my. We all are. We all have done the stupid.
You can do really stupid things momentarily. Mm-hmm. But the question is the guy being honest about it? And I would say for this guy, since we brought him up, he was less than honest whenever people identified who he was. He came out after a couple days, and right away he was, minimizing it. And, I just got caught up in the moment. I went to wave to the camera, and my hand just came up and grazed her back. I didn't even know where it touched. Well, the truth is, he slapped her, and you can see in the video. I mean, it was very intentional, but he slapped, and you couldn't see this on camera, but she said that he slapped and grabbed. So those are the things that you're looking for, Is this a person who's being completely honest and straightforward? Well, in this case, it's not. So this is a guy who, unless he really had a come to Jesus moment, and we don't find any pattern of him doing something like that, he's not coming back. Let's suppose that he does have a come to Jesus moment. He's, I lied on camera. I apologize for that. I apologize for what I did. The church should still be notified, everybody, that he's on the registry and what landed him on the registry in the first place. You have to be transparent. And that's not unfair. That's not asking too much. And keep in mind, too, this is a public registry.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What gives churches the right to circumvent the law and to hide that status from their church and to tuck these guys neatly away inside of the church and put all these people at risk? It makes no sense.
It does not.
So hopefully this is helpful.
Now, this is not a policy, as you said.
Right. These are more principles,
right, principles
that would lead to developing
right,
a policy.
Okay, right. I wanted to make that clear to everybody listening.
But yeah, it's important to get these principles down, because otherwise you're gonna build this policy and be like, okay, why do we have this again? So hopefully this is helpful. And
I guess Granny will be working with Jimmy. And
that's right. We have work to do.
We have work to do.
Christmas Day, chop, chop.
Oh.
I'm coming over bright and early. We're working on this flow chart.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah, I know what Santa's getting me this year.
Yeah.
Big fat nothing.
Oh, you're going to be down with the furnace.
All right. Well, our truth bomb is do your homework. If there are sex offenders who are part of your church or who want to come, just do your homework, do your due diligence, and really be wise about this. There are no blanket policies that work for this. You have to take it case by case, and just be wise, be diligent, and keep your kids safe and each other. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcast, or Stitcher. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.